It's market day in London, sometime around 1340. You're a wool merchant from Bruges. You've just stepped off a ship at the Thames docks after 2 weeks of rough seas, carrying letters of credit stitched into the lining of your coat and enough Flemish cloth to fill a handcart. You don't speak English. You don't know the local laws. And the moment you walk through the city gate, every shopkeeper, guildmaster, and tax collector in London already hates you. Welcome to life as a medieval foreigner. It's nothing like what you'd expect, and I'm warning you right now. This story involves walled enclaves, language tests used to justify murder, rigged legal systems, and a level of xenophobia that makes modern immigration debates look polite. Let's start with something fundamental, because before we can understand what life was like for a foreigner in the Middle Ages, we need to understand what foreign actually meant. And in medieval Europe, it meant something very different from what it means today. What foreign really meant. In modern English, a foreigner is someone from another country. Simple enough. But in medieval Europe, the concept was far more layered and far more local. In medieval English towns, the word foreigner didn't necessarily mean someone from France or Italy. It often meant someone from the next county over. A man born in York who moved to London was technically a foreigner. He couldn't join a guild. He couldn't vote in civic elections. He couldn't trade freely in the marketplace. He was an outsider, lumped together with actual foreigners from across the Channel. The city belonged to its citizens alone. Its law served to protect them above all. Then there were true aliens, people born outside the king's dominions entirely. These were the Flemish weavers, the Italian bankers, the German merchants, the Gascon wine traders, and the Jewish communities scattered across Christendom. Their legal status was precarious at best. In most of medieval Europe, aliens couldn't own freehold land. They couldn't inherit property. They faced higher taxes, trade restrictions, and in many places, they couldn't hold civic office no matter how long they'd lived in a town or how much wealth they'd accumulated. Your foreignness defined your entire legal existence. The merchants who came anyway. Despite all of this, foreigners came. They came in enormous numbers. Between 1330 and 1550, an estimated 64,000 foreigners arrived in England alone, from wealthy Lombard bankers to Flemish laborers. And the reasons were the same ones that drive migration today: opportunity, escape from war, and the chance at a better life. The most powerful group of foreign merchants in Northern Europe were the Germans of the Hanseatic League. This was a confederation of trading cities, mainly from northern Germany, places like Lübeck, Hamburg, Cologne, and Bremen, that dominated maritime commerce across the Baltic and North Seas for centuries. Their London headquarters was a place called the Steelyard, a walled compound on the north bank of the Thames near what is now Cannon Street Station. And when I say walled, I mean it. The Steelyard was essentially a foreign city inside London. It had its own warehouses on the river, its own weighing house, chapel, counting rooms, guild hall, cloth halls, wine cellars, kitchens, and living quarters. Roughly 90 buildings crammed into about 1.3 acres. It was a self-governing German enclave on English soil. The merchants elected their own aldermen. They lived under their own laws, and women were forbidden from setting foot inside its walls. Life inside the Steelyard was governed by iron discipline. If you played dice in your room, you paid a fine. If you entertained non-Hanseatic guests, you paid a fine. If you let a woman cross the compound's threshold, you paid a heavy fine, and half of it went to whoever reported you. Cleanliness in the shared sleeping and packing rooms was strictly enforced, with penalties paid in wax for the candles they burned at All Hallows Church. Drawing a knife on a fellow merchant cost you 100 shillings, an enormous sum when £5 was worth roughly 4 times its later value. Every merchant was required to keep a full suit of armor in his room, ready for trouble. And trouble came often. The Hanseatic merchants enjoyed preferential customs rates and tax exemptions negotiated directly with English kings, privileges that infuriated local traders. English merchants resented watching these Germans operate with advantages they themselves didn't have. No other foreign nation had its own walled liberty on English soil. That resentment simmered for centuries. In 1493, a London mob assembled at the gates of the Steelyard, damaged warehouses, and set fires. The mayor had to intervene with armed guards. 3 years earlier, Hanseatic merchants leaving church were attacked, and one man, the brother of a prominent Cologne merchant, was killed. Then there were the Italians. If the Germans dominated the northern trade routes, Italian merchants and bankers controlled the flow of money across all of Europe. Families from Florence, Lucca, Genoa, and Siena established banking houses in every major city. In Paris alone, by the late 1200s, around 180 Italian merchant banking firms had set up branches. In London, they clustered along what became known as Lombard Street, a name that survives to this day. These Italian bankers were indispensable. They lent money to English kings to fund wars. The Ricciardi family from Lucca bankrolled Edward I's military campaigns. The Bardi and Peruzzi families of Florence extended massive credit to Edward III. They developed bills of exchange that allowed merchants to move money across borders without physically transporting coins, essentially inventing international banking. Many common financial terms, words like debtor, creditor, cash, bank, and bankrupt, came directly from Italian, but being indispensable didn't make you safe. When Edward III defaulted on his debts in the 1340s, the Bardi family went bankrupt in 1343, and the Peruzzi followed in 1346. Centuries of financial expertise wiped out because a king decided not to pay. The law, protection, and persecution. Medieval kings understood that foreign merchants were essential to economic prosperity. They brought goods, skills, and tax revenue. So, from time to time, rulers tried to offer legal protections. The most important of these was the Carta Mercatoria of 1303, a royal charter issued by Edward I to foreign merchants in England. In exchange for paying new customs duties, foreign traders were guaranteed freedom to trade, protection under law, exemption from tolls on bridges and roads, and the right to be tried by a jury that included at least some other foreigners. That last provision was remarkable. It acknowledged something that medieval people understood intuitively. A foreigner couldn't get a fair trial from a jury composed entirely of locals who resented his presence. But here's the catch. English merchants complained bitterly about these privileges, and Edward II revoked the charter. In practice, foreign merchants kept most of their rights, but the legal ground beneath their feet was never stable. Protections could be granted 1 year and stripped away the next, depending entirely on the political needs of the moment. For foreigners lower on the social ladder, life was far more precarious. Flemish weavers and artisans, invited to England by kings eager to develop the domestic cloth industry, worked alongside English laborers who viewed them as direct threats to their livelihoods. The Crown issued letters of protection for these foreign workers, but those letters meant nothing to an angry English weaver whose income was falling. When the violence came, and the violence did come, it came with terrifying regularity. The most shocking episode happened during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Rebels flooding into London didn't just target tax collectors and government officials. They turned on the Flemish community with genocidal fury. Chroniclers record that rebels used language as a weapon, forcing people they suspected of being foreign to say the words bread and cheese. Anyone who couldn't pronounce these words with an English accent was identified as Flemish and killed on the spot. At the Church of St. Martin Vintry, between 30 and 40 Flemish men and women were dragged outside and beheaded. In Clerkenwell, a single attacker killed 7 Flemings in one day. Across London and East Anglia, the death toll among the Flemish community was devastating. This wasn't random mob violence. Historians have traced its roots to decades of economic tension. English weavers had been petitioning the Crown to restrict Flemish competition since the 1330s. Between 1337 and 1381, at least 7 official proclamations were issued, ordering English weavers to stop attacking their Flemish counterparts. None of them worked. The Peasants' Revolt simply gave decades of economic resentment a violent outlet. No community in medieval Europe, however, suffered more sustained persecution than the Jewish population. Jews had been present across Europe for centuries, and their relationship with Christian society was complex. For much of the early Middle Ages, Christians and Jews coexisted in relative peace. They shared language, culture, and even intermarried. Jewish physicians, scholars, and merchants were valued members of many communities. But from the 11th century onward, the situation deteriorated drastically. Because Christian doctrine prohibited lending money at interest, and because Jews were barred from owning land or joining most guilds, many Jewish communities became associated with money lending, one of the few professions open to them. This made them simultaneously essential and despised. Kings borrowed from Jewish lenders to fund wars and building projects, then turned on them when the debts grew inconvenient. England's Edward I squeezed the Jewish community for decades through forced loans and special taxes. When they could no longer pay, he accused them of disloyalty, stripped them of their remaining rights, and in 1290 expelled every Jew from England. Thousands were driven out, some drowned while fleeing. Jews would not be permitted to return for over 3.5 centuries. France followed a similar pattern. King Philip Augustus expelled Jews from the royal domain in 1182, readmitted them for ransom. Then future kings expelled them again in 1306 and 1394. Spain's large and ancient Jewish community, which had flourished under Muslim rule and contributed enormously to science, philosophy, and medicine, was finally expelled in 1492 by Ferdinand and Isabella. Between these mass expulsions, daily life for Jewish communities meant segregation, distinctive badges, and clothing, mandated by the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, restricted neighborhoods that would later become formalized ghettos, and the constant threat of violence sparked by accusations of ritual murder or well poisoning. The ones who stayed. Despite everything, foreigners who could endure the hostility sometimes built extraordinary lives. Some Italian banking families established dynasties in London that lasted generations. Flemish weavers who survived the worst of the violence transformed the English cloth industry, introducing techniques that helped shift England from exporting raw wool to producing finished textiles. German Hanseatic merchants maintained their steelyard compound for roughly 400 years. Foreign artisans brought skills that didn't exist locally. Dutch women introduced brewing techniques to English towns. Flemish craftsmen brought advanced knowledge of drapery and textile finishing. Italian merchants introduced sophisticated accounting methods that transformed European commerce. Kings like Edward III actively encouraged foreign artisans by offering incentives to settle and share their expertise, understanding that economic development depended on importing talent. By the mid-1400s, immigrants could be found in nearly every English village and town. They married locals, raised families, attended parish churches, and gradually became part of the communities that had once rejected them. Some towns granted special status as foreign burgesses, allowing outsiders to acquire limited commercial privileges without full citizenship. But acceptance was always conditional. The moment economic conditions worsened, or political tensions flared, or a plague arrived that needed someone to blame, the foreigner was the first target, always. Why any of this matters? The medieval foreigner occupied an impossible position. Kings needed them for their money, their skills, and their trade connections. Local populations resented them for the same reasons. Legal protections were issued and revoked according to political convenience. Violence could erupt at any moment, triggered by an economic downturn, a failed war, or simply a tavern argument that got out of hand. And yet they kept coming. Merchants crossed seas. Artisans packed their tools. Bankers set up offices in cities where people openly despised them. Entire communities rebuilt after pogroms and expulsions. They did it because medieval Europe, for all its dangers, was also a place of extraordinary economic opportunity, intellectual exchange, and cultural transformation that simply couldn't have happened without the movement of people across borders. The Hanseatic merchants who lived behind the walls of the Steelyard, the Italian bankers who invented modern finance on Lombard Street, the Flemish weavers who revolutionized English industry, the Jewish scholars whose intellectual achievements enriched every field of knowledge, they were all foreigners. And medieval Europe was built, in no small part, on their labor, their capital, and their courage. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what life was really like for a medieval foreigner, hit that like button and subscribe for more from the medieval worker. What other medieval lives would you like to see covered? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching. See you in the next one.